The sounds Jesus heard every morning. Hook. Close your eyes for a moment. Before the miracles. Before the crowds. Before the cross. There was a boy waking up in a small stone house, in a town so small that most maps of the ancient world never even mention it. What did he hear in that first quiet moment of the day? A rooster. A hammer striking wood. A mother's voice calling him to rise. These sounds seem ordinary, but they are the forgotten soundtrack of the most extraordinary life in human history. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, you will never read the Gospels the same way again. Introduction. We know Jesus through his words, his miracles, his final days in Jerusalem. But long before any of that, there was simply a carpenter's home in Nazareth. Mornings, they were not filled with thunder or angels. They were filled with roosters, grinding stones, footsteps on packed dirt, and the low murmur of a family beginning another ordinary day. Historians cannot recover his exact words. No recording exists of his childhood, but archaeology, ancient Jewish customs, and the geography of Galilee let us reconstruct something remarkable. The actual sounds that likely surrounded him every single morning. And once you hear them, the story of Jesus feels less like a legend from a distant sky, and more like a life lived on the same dusty ground we still walk on today. Scene 1. The Rooster and the First Light. Nazareth, 1st century Galilee. A hillside village of perhaps a few hundred people, built from limestone, carved partly into the rock itself. Before sunrise, the sky over the hills turns a pale gray, and somewhere nearby, a rooster begins to caw. This sound would have been so common that Jesus later used it in one of his most personal teachings. His prediction, tupida, that the rooster would crow before the disciple denied him 3 times. Some scholars believe this detail was not random. In a culture without clocks, the rooster's crow marked time itself. It divided night from day, safety from danger, sleep from work. For Jesus, this was simply morning. But something unexpected sits inside this ordinary detail. The same sound that woke him as a child would return. Decades later, in the darkest night of his ministry, echoing through a courtyard in Jerusalem, tied forever to betrayal and grief. A child's morning noise, transformed into a prophecy. Scene 2. The grinding stone inside the house. Another sound begins. A low, rhythmic scraping, stone against stone. This was the sound of a hand mill, grinding grain into flour for the day's bread. In most Galilean homes, this task fell to the women of the household, likely Mary, perhaps with help from other family members. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these small basalt, grinding stones across ancient Israel, worn smooth from years of daily use. They tell us something the Gospels never explicitly state. Mornings in Jesus' home began with labor, not luxury. There was no bakery down the street, no market open before dawn. If a family wanted bread, someone had to grind the grain themselves, every single morning, by hand. Historians are not certain exactly how many people lived under Joseph's roof. The Jewish family structures of the time suggest a busy household, meaning this grinding sound may have started before the sun even cleared the hills. Jesus grew up surrounded by this sound of quiet, repetitive labor. It shaped how he later spoke about bread, about daily provision, about asking simply for our daily bread, words that carry far more weight once you understand what daily bread actually required. Scene 3. Footsteps in the village. Waking up, step outside the door, and Nazareth itself begins to stir. Sandaled feet on packed earth, wooden doors creaking open, goats bleating as they're led out to graze on the hillside terraces. Nazareth sat along a ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley, a fertile stretch of land that connected trade routes running toward the coast, toward Egypt, toward the great cities of the Roman world. This meant Jesus' quiet village was never truly isolated. Even in a town this small, morning sounds may have carried hints of a much larger world. Distant caravans, occasional travelers, the faint memory of Roman soldiers passing along nearby roads. Few people noticed this important detail. Jesus did not grow up in total isolation from Roman power. Sepphoris, a much larger city under construction during his childhood, sat only a few miles from Nazareth. Some scholars believe Joseph, and later Jesus himself, may have worked there as builders, walking that road morning after morning. If true, This reshapes everything. The sounds of Jesus' mourning may not have been only sheep and grinding stones. They may have included hammers, chisels, and the construction noise of a Roman-influenced city rising nearby. A boy from a humble village, walking daily into the edge of empire. Scene 4. The carpenter's house back inside the home. Another sound joins the morning chorus. Wood being handled. Tools being gathered. The steady, practical rhythm of a carpenter's workshop preparing for the day. The Greek word used to describe Joseph's trade, tekton, suggests more than woodworking alone. It likely included stonework and construction, skilled manual labor essential to daily life in Galilee. Jesus, trained in this trade from a young age, would have known the particular sound of tools long before he ever spoke a public word. The scrape of a plane against wood, the tap of a chisel, the weight of timber being lifted and set into place. What happened next changed the meaning of these sounds forever. Because this same craftsman, familiar with wood and structure and the patient work of building something by hand, would one day carry a wooden beam through the streets of Jerusalem and be nailed to it. The tools of his mourning became the instrument of his death. Scene 5. Voices of family and faith. And beneath all these sounds, the rooster, the grinding stone, the tools, there was something else. Voices. A mother's voice, perhaps siblings, mentioned briefly in the Gospels: James, Joseph, Simon, Judas, and unnamed sisters. The ordinate chatter of a working-class Jewish household beginning its day, and running through all of it, another sound. Prayer. Devout Jewish families of this era typically began their day with the Shema, a declaration of faith spoken aloud each morning. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Historians cannot know exactly how Jesus' family practiced this ritual, but the tradition was so central to Jewish daily life that its rhythm likely shaped his very first waking thoughts. Before bread was ground, before tools were lifted, before the village fully woke. This tiny detail reveals something extraordinary. Long before Jesus taught crowds about God, God's name was likely the very first sound he spoke each morning of his life. Emotional peak picture, it one final time. A small stone house. Gray morning light easing over the hills of Nazareth. A rooster crows in the distance. A woman kneels beside a grinding stone, and the low scrape of grain becomes the heartbeat of the household. Wood is gathered. Sandals shuffle across the floor. A prayer rises quietly into the still morning air. And somewhere in the middle of all this, no thunder, no crowd, no miracle. A child breathes in the ordinary sounds of another day. He does not yet know what he will become. He does not yet know that a rooster's cry will one day mark the night of his greatest betrayal. He does not yet know that the wood he learns to shape with his hands will one day be shaped around his own body. He is simply a boy waking up, and that, perhaps, is the most staggering truth of all. Ending. We often imagine Jesus surrounded by miracles, parting crowds, healing the sick, calming storms. But before any of that, he lived an unremarkable mourning, again and again, for 30 years. He heard roosters, he heard grinding stones, he heard hammers and footsteps. In his mother's voice, these were not small details. They were the quiet foundation of a life that would eventually reshape human history. Perhaps that is a real lesson hidden in these forgotten sounds. Greatness does not always begin with thunder. Sometimes it begins with a rooster's crow and an ordinary morning that no one thought to remember. Until now.